Welcome back to another edition of Unfiltered. Officially, this will go down as episode number 314 in your scorecards. You can jump on board 24/7, 365. It is easy. Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts at Unfiltered with Casey Stern on YouTube or Instagram, and at Casey Stern on Twitter or X. Our guest today back on the program, good friend Mark Feinsand. You can catch his latest article on MLB.com. Talk about how the division races will affect the trade deadline now a week away, and we'll get into that and much, much more. Mark, appreciate you, especially during a busy time, sir. How are you?
I'm good, my man. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I want to kind of, and I want to get into the races and all of that. But the first thing for me that is always interesting about the deadline now compared to when we did it many years ago, with the state of the wild cards and having so many teams in it. When we used to do this, you and I go back a long time. You would know who the buyers and the sellers were. So you could sit there and know what teams were going to be on speed dial and who was giving in, right? A long time beforehand. How difficult is it now in this landscape with so many teams, even those under 500, still teetering within distance of a playoff spot?
It's much more difficult. I mean, we've been, talking about the trade deadline and sort of how this was going to shape out for probably a month now, and we've basically been looking at five teams for the most part. With the White Sox and the A's, the Angels, the Rockies, and the Marlins. Now you can add, the Blue Jays. I think you can add into that seller mix. The Rangers are kind of on the edge. They're still in the race in the AL West, even though they're 4 games under 500. And then in the National League, I mean, every team in the National League is within 4.5 games of a playoff spot, other than Colorado and Miami. So it makes it a lot more difficult. I think this is, you know, there are people who have called for the trade deadline to be pushed back to August 15th because it would give a little more clarity and teams wouldn't have to make that decision with 2 full months left in the season. But then we'll be at August 15th and there will be 11 teams within 4.5 games of a spot. And you'll go, oh, maybe they push to September 1st. So, at some point, teams have to make a decision. This is where self reflection and self analysis comes into play of, okay, my team, I'm a general manager of a team that's 4 games out, but we're 5 games under 500. So even if we're able to sneak into a wild card, I mean, Arizona showed us last year, just got to get in, right? 83 wins, got to the World Series. But do you believe that your team is capable of putting together such a run in October? And that's where these teams have to make a decision to buy, sell, or stand pat.
You even think about Philadelphia a couple of years ago, right? Not great during the season. At the end, barely kind of get in and then push in the postseason, and we're at their best. And that's all that matters. I mean, just go ask the Dodgers, wiped out in 3 games last year after the season that they had. I'll get into the Dodgers in a second. We'll go out west. But I want to start here because when you talk about and looking at your article in the races, and when you start with the American League East, I'll ask it this way, especially after last year, where I don't think they pushed the pedal far enough in Baltimore because of how close they were. No offense to Jack Flaherty, who now would have been a better acquisition based on the way he's pitching now than he was a year ago, ironically. Are they under more pressure than anybody else? I know it's not the market of the Dodgers or the Yankees. What with the kind of roster they have, Mark, and how close they are, what kind of pressure are the Orioles under here the next week?
I think last year was a case of they were probably a year earlier than most people thought they would be. And it was sort of like, all right, let's not upset the apple cart here and break up any of this core or break up any of these prospects. And we have a plan here. Clearly, it's working this year, and let's look forward after that. Remember, it's also a different ownership group. They have a new ownership group this year that might be willing to spend more money than they were a year ago. So I think there is definitely some pressure, especially knowing that Brian Cashman and the Yankees aren't going to be quiet in the next week. They're going to go out and make moves that they think they need to make. Now, the Yankees have more moves than they need to make than the Orioles do. So, if I'm Mike Elias, I'm looking all over the place at starting pitching. I'm looking at bullpen help. Their lineup is pretty steady. I think, the pitching is really where they need to make waves. And, obviously they did so bringing in Corbin Burns this year. He's been outstanding. And the big question in Baltimore is going to be, can they re-sign him and keep him in the rotation beyond 2024? But I think there's definitely more pressure this year than there was last year. Baltimore still has, I believe they're still the top rated farm system in the league, even after graduating all of these guys to the big leagues. So they have plenty of prospect capital. They're not going to trade Jackson Holiday. Could
Thank
they
you.
trade Sam
Thank you.
Messiah or
Yeah.
Kobe Mayo? Maybe. Kobe Mayo could be their first baseman in the future. Masayo could be their first baseman in the future because I don't think Emily Rutschman's leaving the plate anytime soon. So they have a lot of options. They have a lot of capital from which to deal. So if they want to make a big move, they want to go get Garrett Crochet and Luis Robert, or whoever they want. They're the one team that has enough goods to make any deal they want, pretty much. The question is, are they going to make it?
Obviously, you can always make it with Bet Online, or our sponsors got to pay them off. Most trusted betting platform, number one source for all your betting needs. 50% free bet right now, up to $250 in your first deposit. Bet anything from the Olympics, Formula One racing, of course, all sports in between, live odds. Then when the game's over, get to the casino, blackjack, poker, over 150 slot games. Get to the website now and use the promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, 50% free bet credit up to $250. Bet Online, the game starts here. I want to go back to, for a second, the Jackson Holiday comment you made, because thank you. Because, look, I get the idea, and this is coming from the prospects are cool, parades are cooler guy, which does not mean you trade all your prospects. It means if you have a chance to push the pedal, you do. But the idea, because the Orioles are so stacked, that they would then go ahead and trade the best prospect in baseball because right now they don't technically need him on the field to win, is insanity to me. A lot of this is coming from specifically the idea that maybe a Tariq Skubal could be available. We're always looking for, trying to find that white whale, right, that we don't think is on the board and make him on the board. Is there that guy this year outside of the Crochets, who we'll get into, and some of the names that we know will be available? Is there somebody, whether it's a Vlad Guerrero Jr. on a hitting side or whoever, that you think, well, there's a possibility that could be plucked that maybe we're not thinking about?
I think Skubal's the guy who, if there is a huge deal to be made, he's the guy. He's probably the front runner in the American League for the Cy Young Award. Certainly him and Burns. He's got 2 years of control left, and that's a huge get if you're able to add that guy to your rotation. It would also take some of the pressure off the Orioles in terms of having to give Corbin Burns a giant contract after the year, because you'd say, all right, Skubal's our ace going forward, and we'll try to fill in behind him. Like I said, Baltimore is in a position to make such a deal if it wants to, and it doesn't have to include Jackson Holiday. I know Jackson Holiday had a rough go at it when he came up earlier this year, but if you're going to let 2 or 3 weeks define what a 19 or 20-year-old kid's going to be for the next 15, that's just silly. So I don't see them trading Holiday under any circumstance. I'm not sure. Maybe if Pittsburgh says, "Hey, we'll give you Paul Skeens. What do you think?" Still not even sure, because quite honestly, the injury risk of a guy like Skeens
Yeah,
is
that's
much
right.
greater than that of a Holiday. So,
That's right.
let's put Jackson Holiday out of this conversation. He's not getting traded. But you mentioned Vlad Guerrero. The Blue Jays have been adamant that they're not trading Vlad or Bo Bichette. And teams are adamant about not trading a guy right up until the point where they trade them. So the Blue Jays are what, 9 games under 500. They're 15 games out in the division. They're 10 games out of the third wild card spot. Could they pivot and say, you know what, this team isn't going to be what we thought it was going to be even next year, and this is a chance to really spark a rebuild and try to do it quickly? I could see that happening. I would still put the odds at less than 50% that if Vlad gets moved. But if a team, if a Seattle comes in or a Baltimore comes in and says, we need this guy and we're willing to overpay for him, it would be, sort of organizational malpractice to not at least listen and consider such a deal. But like you said, with the number of contenders that are still out there, it's hard to look at teams and say, all right, well, this team could trade this guy, this team could trade this guy, because we're really only picking from a group of maybe 8 teams. And a lot of those teams are really bad for a reason. They don't have really good players. So, you look at a Colorado and you're like, well, they're a seller.
Yeah,
Okay, who are they selling?
right.
Right? Miami, they've got some interesting names. I mean,
Chisholm. Yeah.
Tanner Scott is going to get moved. He's a free agent.
Yep.
Chisholm, I think, has a really good chance to get moved. And the question is, how much do you like Jazz, and do you think he is that impact player?
Not based on the overrated list. The rest of the players don't, based on that list that came. So,
Right.
I mean, yeah.
But remember, I think at one point Bryce Harper was listed
Yeah,
as
he
number
was.
one on
He
those
was.
overrated lists
He
too.
was.
So
He was. And a
pretty
lot of
sure
Yankees, because nobody liked them.
those don't always pan out as being, Bryce Harper's the most overrated player in the game. Yeah, and the other 29 teams would happily add him to their roster. And I'm not trying to put Jazz Chisholm and Bryce Harper in the same spot.
No,
Just
I
making
get
a
it.
point.
I get it.
But I just think you look at some of these teams and you're like, the Angels have some nice pieces to move. Are any of them going to be huge impact players? Probably not. Same thing with the A's. Our Brent Rooker's having a phenomenal year. Guy's one of the best hitters in the game. He could make a difference, and he's under control for 2 or 3 more years. So that's an interesting name to me. If I'm a team, uh, especially a mid to small market team, saying this guy doesn't make very much money. He's under control for 3 more years. He's got an OPS over 900. He's got 21 or 22 home runs, and he did it last year as well. This could be a piece where it's not a big, sexy name. It's not Vlad Guerrero Jr., but Brent Rooker could be the kind of guy who actually could make a big impact on one of these races.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was just going to talk about that. You mentioned the big, sexy names. I was looking at your list that you put out of the top players at each position who are available. And I'm thinking of like years past. It doesn't mean everybody's getting traded, but even these lists that we've done in the past where you think about who's available, there are a lot less sexy names this year. I mean, you've got certainly some sexy performers in terms of what Crochet has done and what he's built. But you think about 2 years ago, or even a year ago, what his name was. We usually have that kind of the Pete Alonso, who clearly not going to be available, or some of these other guys who are in the spotlight. But there are a lot of guys who can certainly make some noise. And you mentioned bullpen. That's always where that damage is done, where people are making decisions that are impacting in the postseason that you don't think are big mark at the time until all of a sudden those guys get added. And I'm not talking about the big names like the Andrew Millers from years ago, one of the best deadline deals we've seen. But outside of Scott, who are some of the other relievers that you think we should be paying attention to that could be moved?
Well, I think Carlos Estevez on the Angels is definitely up there. He had a really bad start to the year, and then I think he went like 12 or 13 games without allowing a base runner. He threw a perfect game over 9 games. I know that. So he's a guy I think you could look at. There. The one thing about bullpen arms, there's always a million of them, right? Jalen Beeks in Colorado, he probably gets
Yep.
moved. Washington could still move Kyle Finnegan if they already moved Hunter Harvey. So there are plenty of guys out there. Michael Kopech could be another White Sox who could be on the
Hmm.
move. I don't think the Blue Jays trade Jordan Romano. He's got 1 year of control left. But again, if the other relievers, let's say Scott and Estevez and these other guys move, and there's still a contender out there who's left without a seat in musical chairs, and they may say Romano's good, he's healthy again. Let's go for him. Let's try to overwhelm Toronto for him. So, the one thing about bullpen moves is that let's say there are 21 or 22 teams that are still in the playoff race. I would say 21 or 22 of them could use another
Oh,
relief pitcher. So there's always relief pitching to be had. And even a guy who you might not look at and say, well, that's a game changing reliever, maybe a team looks at him and sees a specific metric or how they do against lefties, or, they're a ground ball guy and they don't have that guy to come out of the bullpen to try to get the double play. There's always guys who are going to be interesting to teams just based on what they need. It might not be like you said, big sexy names. I remember when the Yankees traded for Clay Holmes, it was like, ho hum, who cares? And now the guy's been an all-star team and is probably going to cash in pretty nicely in free agency this year. So it doesn't have to be Aroldis Chapman or Andrew Miller to be an impactful guy come playoff time.
you mentioned Kopech, Fetty, obviously also not a bullpen arm, but also could be moved. You think about Crochet, the White Sox. We know kind of what they are. The Cubs are certainly a disappointment. I mean, a lot of people looked at them going into the season and thought that they would be a team that now would take the next step coming off of last year. Clearly, that's why you bring Craig Counsell in, and way too much has been put on him. And I love David Ross, but it's not. Craig Counsell is if David Ross was still there, this idea that the Cubs would be somewhere that they're not now, I'm not buying into, but they're not in a good spot. And Jed Hoyer, I know, came out and made comments yesterday basically saying that they're not making moves clearly for 2024 if it's something that can help them beyond. Are they kind of as disappointing as anybody when you think about where they sit right now? I know Texas, obviously, following the championship season hasn't been great, and there have been some others. And we mentioned Toronto, but how about where the Cubs fit now, a week into this mix before the deadline mark?
Yeah, I would put Toronto probably as a slightly bigger disappointing team. Texas, I mean, you came into the year knowing you had a lot of pitching injury issues and guys weren't going to be healthy coming into the year. Um, I think people had higher hopes for Detroit as being one of those sort of trendy picks early in the season as a potential playoff team. But I would say, the Cubs are certainly up there. And here's the thing, things aren't going to get easier in that division. Pittsburgh is only on its way up. I mean, they've got, those 3 young arms with Skeens and Jones and Keller that really have the foundation of a really good rotation, with some young position players there as well who are making strides. So that division, Milwaukee just does its thing. They're sort of like a National League Tampa Bay, right? I mean, every year you look at their roster and go,
It's
really,
amazing.
Milwaukee? And yet and yet they just figure it out. St. Louis has had a bit of a bounce back year, so that division is not as easy as it seemed like it might be. The Cubs, I don't blame Jed Hoyer for not looking at rentals and 24 upgrades because right now, yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier. They're 3.5 games out of a playoff spot right now. But Jed looks at his roster and probably says, we're not going to be able to contend with Philadelphia and Atlanta and the Dodgers or even the Brewers come October. So why am I going to push all my chips to the middle for something that's going to be a long shot at best? So I think the Cubs are certainly up there. Council, everybody said, oh, Craig Council, they're going to win the division now because they have Craig Council. And Milwaukee lost Craig Council. So A minus B equals C.
Yeah,
It
right.
doesn't always work that way, unfortunately, for the Cubs. I think they still have a bright future. I mean, you look at certainly what Imanaga's done this year. He's been a fantastic signing.
Mhm.
Bellinger's been inconsistent and injured. I think they've got some work to do if they're going to try to contend. And so Jed's probably very smart to say, look, if we can make some moves, not a fire sale by any means, but if we can make some moves that'll help us bring in some guys who will be controllable and help us in 25 and beyond, that's probably the right approach right now.
You mentioned Atlanta, and they're one of the interesting teams for me because we all know what Alex Anthopoulos is capable of. We've seen what he's done over the years, and we know that he seems to always find that right move. And you might not know at the time. We didn't know maybe Soler or Peterson at the time were those moves, and they just pan out. But, from Strider at the beginning to Acuna to Albie, all the injuries that this team has, they're still in a great spot. They're gonna make the playoffs. They've got guys with some pedigree. They've got a team that knows how to win if you believe in the importance of that. But how aggressive do you expect Alex, who's normally an aggressive guy, to be, knowing still how many injuries and holes this team's really got on this roster, Mark?
Would it surprise you at all if Whit Merrifield goes out and all of a sudden has like an
Oh,
870 OPS and
of
just
course not.
finds the fountain of youth in
Of
Atlanta? I
course
mean,
not.
Alex is a wizard at pulling the rabbit out of the hat.
Yep.
And he's one of those guys, we always talk about like Jerry Dipoto and AJ Preller. They're kind of mavericks. They just, Trader Jerry and AJ is never any predicting what the Padres will do. Uh, and yet every time Alex makes a move in Atlanta, you sort of go, really? And then all of a sudden you look up a month later and that guy's hitting 320
Yep.
or is 5-0. So
Yep.
I don't look past Anthopoulos and the Braves. That they'll make some moves. I think they're still probably scouring the market for another outfielder. The rotation, as good as it's been with those three guys who made the All Star team, you know, Chris Sale still hasn't been the healthiest guy in the world, and if he walked off the mound holding his elbow one day, would anybody be surprised? So I
No.
think there's probably the need to add some depth to the rotation and find an outfielder. Obviously now second base with Albie's out for a while could be an issue. They'll see if Merrifield helps that. Maybe they look at some of the other trade candidates out there and just try to find a stopgap. But I don't. I never put it past Alex Anthopoulos to go out and do something that will wind up being exactly what they needed.
Obviously we talk about disappointments with the Cubs earlier and how things, have changed so quickly for the Mets, who, if you went to the beginning of May or into June 1st, I think, until now, they've got still among, if not still the best record in Major League Baseball. Senga on the way back. Things to feel good about. They're not a World Series team, but they're in a playoff spot. They got a chance to make the playoffs. They're not sellers anymore. But it's David Stern's first time around, a team that's been too aggressive and has failed in the past, not thinking about the future, right? And now all of a sudden, Mark, they're not in a place they thought they'd be, where all the kids come up in September and they get to figure out what they have. Now they got to go try and win. How aggressive do you expect them to be in the next week?
Well, I just think back to, maybe 6, 8 weeks ago when all these dopey reporters were writing columns about, well, the Mets are going to trade Pete Alonso and the Astros are going to trade Alex Bregman and all
Yeah,
these big names are going to be
right.
on the
How about
move.
the
And
Astros?
of
Right.
course, when I speak about dopey reporters writing that, I'm talking about myself because obviously you got to wear it when you write those things in May and June, and then both teams go on a run and all of a sudden the Mets are in a playoff spot or close to it, and the Astros are tied for first place, and you're like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly what we knew was going to happen. I expect the Mets to be, I don't know if aggressive is the word I would use, but I certainly think they'll be a buyer. I don't think they're going to mortgage the farm or trade any of their big young guys to, try to make a big run because I think there's still a sizable gap between them and the Phillies. Forgetting the standings, I mean just
No,
as a
sure.
club.
Yes. Yes.
The Phillies to me are the most complete team in the game, and it's not
Agreed.
even close.
Agreed.
Their rotation is astoundingly good, and that lineup is just one after another. It's relentless. They just come at you. So I don't think the Mets will go out and say, "All right, this is our year. Let's go." But at the same time, I think they need some bullpen help for sure, and I would expect David Stearns to go out and do that. And like we said, there are plenty of relievers on the market. There are plenty of rental relievers on the market, and I know that hasn't been his mo when he was in Milwaukee, but that's because they were in a different payroll situation where they couldn't just take on money necessarily and not have something to show for it beyond this year. Well, Steve Cohen has plenty of money, and if they want to add a couple of relievers that make some money, I think adding, a Scott or an Estevez, one of those
Hmm.
guys, that'll cost you like 2 million for the rest of the year. But I mean, literally, he'll pull it out of his couch, right? So that's not that's not going to hold the Mets back from doing that. The question is, what will it cost prospect wise? I think David will be very uh, conservative in terms of giving away any of his best prospects for rental players. But I would expect that there will be some bullpen help coming, at some point here. And could they make some other moves on the margins? Yeah, I don't think they're going to make any. I don't think you're going to hear about them in the Luis Robert or Garrett Crochet kind of trades.
I got two more quickies for you, and I appreciate all this time. One, I go back to, and I was saying this recently, you know, the small market teams sometimes will push and make moves when they're close. And I go to the AL Central, years ago, and I think I mentioned the Andrew Miller deal. I think about, the Royals trading for Johnny Cueto as a rental and trading three controllable left-handers at the time, which was a crazy thing because they knew that Cueto wasn't coming back. And Ensign Volquez, another one they added. We've seen these teams do this before. The Central's been way better than we thought. These three teams are all sitting there right there. Do you expect maybe a surprise or two from one of those teams in terms of making a move that pushes the pedal a little bit or takes on some rental money that you wouldn't expect, Mark, because they're in this mix?
No. I I think all of these teams, I mean, Minnesota's got its TV situation, which makes its payroll
Yeah.
situation a little sensitive. The Guardians are not a team that typically takes on a lot of money, and I don't anticipate, I'm not saying they won't make moves. They will try to tweak the roster for the
Sure.
stretch run, but I don't see them taking on a big salary. And the Royals are sort of like I talked about the Orioles a year ago. The Royals are a year ahead of where everybody thought they would be. When I say everybody, I don't include myself because I did pick them to win the Central this year, and I don't know that they're going
Oh,
to win
good
the
for you. There
Central.
you go.
But the fact that they're in the postseason mix right
They're
now,
right
I feel
there.
pretty good about
They're
that
there.
prediction. And I'm just putting that out there because I have so many other bad predictions that when I get one actually sort of right, I feel like I need to point that out. Um, and I think Kansas City's in a spot too where they know they need bullpen help. They probably need to add a bat as well. But I don't think that JJ Piccolo is going to stray from a plan of this was our plan of how we're going to get back in this and contend. They've got some good young players. They've made some really good moves. Obviously, the Reagans trade last year was a game changer for them. And I think they'll look to improve. They went out and traded for Hunter Harvey, and they paid a price for him. He's controllable beyond this year, though. So this wasn't a situation of we're going for it this year. I think you'll see moves from all three of those teams, but I wouldn't expect to see any of those where you say, "Wow, I can't believe they took on that salary."
Let me close with the Dodgers. I remember, and we've all talked about this, but we talked before the season. The Dodgers were the team that had to win. I mean, that they had that tag for a while because of the money they spend, but then it was to an umpteenth level when you thought about all the money for Yamamoto and then Otani. They've dealt with a lot of injuries. Dave Roberts never going to get credit for that because last year they had no business being where they were with all the pitching injuries nobody wants to talk about. But here they are, and with all that they haven't done, because people expect them to go like 40-2 in a 42 game stretch, they're right there where they need to be. How much are they up against it with now Otani, everything in tow into a postseason, off of last year, Mark losing those 3 games and going home to do whatever is necessary to put them in the position to go win a World Series?
You know what's funny is most teams, if they had traded for Tyler Glass now and given him the extension that they gave him, they would have been like, and that Tyler Glass now move, you didn't even mention it. It wasn't even a mention
Yeah,
of what they
yeah,
did in the
I know.
offseason, right?
Teoscar
It
Hernandez. And
it
also,
was like a
yeah, yeah,
distant
Teoscar
third behind
Hernandez.
Otani and
That's right.
Yamamoto, right?
That's right.
Which just shows you what the Dodgers are capable of doing.
Yeah.
And they're capable of doing it now as well. And that's a team where if there's a player out there with a salary that a team wants to shed, the Dodgers won't be afraid to go out and get that guy. He's like a Rosarena, right? The Rays are, he's making $8 million. He's under control for 2 more years, but those arbitration numbers are going to go up. So, I think the Dodgers will be aggressive. They don't have to worry about winning the division. They've got an 8.5 game lead on the Padres, and I don't think that's an issue. They're getting a little healthier. They're going to get Mookie back next month. They're going to get Muncy back. They have Glass now back. Kershaw comes back. We don't know what the deal with Yamamoto is going to be. But yeah, look, every year the Dodgers have the pressure of, okay, you won another 103 games. Now what? And it reminds me of those Yankee teams that I covered between 2002 and 2007. The last 6 years of the Joe Torre era, they would win 100 games every year, 98 games, whatever it was. And some of those years they were dealing with injuries. I mean, that '05 team, they lost their whole pitching staff, and people forget it was Sean Chacon, Aaron Small, and Al Leiter who carried them to a 95 wins and a division title. But every one of
Uh-huh.
those years, it was like, all right, ho hum, you won another 95 to 100 games, and then you got knocked out in the first round, or you went to the ALCS and lost there. And even when they got to the World Series in '03, it was like, well, great, then you lost to the Marlins, so the season was a failure, and that was the whole, Steinbrenner edict, and which Jeter totally bought into and sort of sold
Yep.
that to the fans. And if you don't win the World Series, the season's a failure. The Dodgers are there now, where they can win 105 games, they can get to the NLCS, they can get to the World Series, but if you're not flying a flag at the end of the season, then who cares? And so I think there's probably as much pressure on the Dodgers as there is on any team out there to win the World Series. Not just to get to the playoffs, not just to win your division, not just to get to the World Series, to win the World Series. Because even the one that they won was the bubble year, and some people look at it and say, "Well, okay, did they won the World Series in a 60-game season and a weird fanless, neutral site playoffs and whatever." It's a World Series. I don't believe that. I think you won that World Series. You fly that flag proudly, and you'd be happy about that. But I think there is still a little bit of a bitter taste in the Dodgers' mouth that some people do look at that title that way. And after making a Betts trade and making signing Freddie Freeman and signing Otani and all these other guys, yeah, there's a lot of pressure on them. I think Andrew Freeman will make a few moves to try to supplement, but really getting healthy and staying healthy is the best thing that can happen to the Dodgers because there's so much talent on that roster. I could see them adding an outfielder and maybe a bullpen piece or something. They probably could use a starting pitcher because you don't know what's going to happen with Yamamoto. You don't know what Kershaw is going to look like when he gets back, and you don't know if Glasnow can stay healthy. So there are question marks there. And because of the expectations and the pressure on them to win the World Series, I think they will be as aggressive as they can be.
I am super appreciative of all this time. I know how swamped and busy you are. Thank you for repping the Canes as always. Where's the Knicks hat? Mikael Bridges, hello. I mean, we lost Hartenstein. A little worried about
Yeah,
that. A little worried about
I
that.
am too, but centers are always available, like trade deadline at time. Right, last year Gafford was available. He
True.
ended up being a real
That's
big
true.
piece.
That's true.
The biggest thing for me is can Mitch stay healthy because that's going to
Yes.
be huge without Hartenstein there. Obviously, I was very happy with the Bridges move. I think
Yes.
this is the most excited I've been about a Knicks team going into a season. Because
Oh,
last year, I didn't have the expectations of what I did maybe come January, February. But bringing OG back, getting Bridges, this is the most excited I've been going into a season for the Knicks. I mean,
yeah.
since the 90s.
Since the day that I remember where I was sitting on Long Island outside my house, listening to WFAN when a 2020 said that they had signed Larry Johnson, Allen Houston, and Chris Childs all in like one day. That was like
Yep.
the last time. I mean, that's how long ago. And this team is gonna have a chance to be better than that team was in the late '90s,
Yeah, I
which
still
is
don't think they're as good as the Celtics, but you
no,
don't have to be as good as the Celtics.
no.
You have to be better than the Celtics for 4 out of 7 games, hopefully. So there's still some
Positivity.
time for NBA season. 6 words for you that I'll leave you with:
Go ahead.
Jaden Daniels, Rookie of the Year.
See, another, and always predictions are always for this guy. You can get us on
And they're always
Unfiltered.
wrong. So what am I doing to myself here?
Oh God, we'll see you next time on Unfiltered. As always, presented by Ben.